You're stuck with me, Sky Guy.
Race you to the top.
I'll give you a head start.
My designation is Trooper 27-5555, sir. We call him Fives. I'm Heavy. This is Echo. War does not come with a guarantee. Echo!
Eventually, you'll have to do the right thing.
I'm sorry, Master, but I'm not coming back.
The mission. The nightmares. They're finally over.
The cavalry has arrived!
Star Wars: The Clone Wars, one of the most popular and beloved pieces of Star Wars content and cartoons alike, with nearly universal awe and support from the fandom. Whether it be because of the intricate story or the amazing characters, that show definitely had a lot to offer us, and its legacy is still felt to this very day, as now, a new show has arisen to take its place after the final season's end about a year prior. The show in question is, of course, The Bad Batch. Its first season has just ended, and I thought that the show had a pretty decent start overall. When I first saw the trailers for this show, I was getting major Clone Wars vibes, as if it were the 8th season of the latter. There were plenty of episodes that stood out to me, for a variety of reasons. However, despite all the good things this show had to offer us, some of its flaws have been called out into question in recent weeks. Some have claimed the show started off well, but then slowly degraded over time like a rotting tomato. In short, there's been a lot of divisive reviews about the show, with some saying it was good, whereas others thought it was boring. But all things considered, did The Bad Batch really become the worthy successor to Clone Wars, or has it failed at that? In this video, I'll try my best to put that question to the test, and we'll see what's in store for the Bad Batch in the present and going forward. With that being said, however, let us begin.
And as per usual, go check out the entire series before you run into spoilers by clicking on this video.
In order to understand the reasons for why this show came to be in the first place, we need to rewind the clock and take a trip down memory lane. The year was 2012. In late October of that year, Disney had officially bought Star Wars, and they were now in full control over Lucasfilm. Around the same time period, the 5th season of Clone Wars was being aired. Fans were shocked to see the return of Maul, and they didn't know whether or not Ahsoka would survive. However, another event would occur shortly after Disney bought Star Wars. Due to various complications that arose, Disney made the difficult decision to outright cancel the remainder of the Clone Wars. This decision evidently upset many Star Wars fans around the globe, especially given how popular Clone Wars was. 2013 rolled around, where Season 5 of the show would conclude in March of that very year, and to plenty, that seemed to be the end of the Clone Wars. However, there were a lot of loose threads that were left unanswered. Where did Ahsoka go after making the sudden decision to walk away? Whatever happened to characters such as Rex, Maul, Ventress, and Bo-Katan? These loose threads would go unanswered for up to years after the show's conclusion. All fans could hope for was for something major to occur if these loose ends were really going to be tied up one day. But if the decision to cancel the show came from the higher-ups themselves, it all seemed hopeless. However, the Clone Wars actually did come back, albeit only partially. Just before Disney had canceled the show, the 6th season was in development, with 13 episodes of it completed. Season 6 aired in March 2014 on Netflix, exactly 1 year after the end of the previous season. It was a season packed with mystery. and although the season was only a shell of what it was intended to be, fans, including myself, assumed that this would be the end, and we all simply closed the book after watching the final arc. Later on in 2014, another show would come out, which would turn out to be Star Wars Rebels. The latter show was definitely an attempt to please viewers who are upset over the Clone Wars' cancellation. And while it did appeal to a younger audience, older Star Wars nerds who were fans of the Clone Wars clearly had their gripes and pet peeves with this show. As the show continued to progress, there were indeed some promising moments, but the vibe still felt off. It simply wasn't the same as Clone Wars despite the attempts to bring some characters from the show into Rebels, and on top of that, even the characters that were brought onto Rebels didn't feel the same as their Clone Wars selves. Rebels would continue on until 2018, when it would finally conclude after over 4 seasons of running. By this point, we not only got to see some Clone Wars characters return in Rebels, but we had also gained the knowledge of what would have happened had the show not been cancelled. It would have continued onwards until either Season 7 or 8, and it would have ended with Ahsoka and Rex escaping Order 66. Additionally, the planned arcs that ended up getting cancelled were now being told through comic books, unfinished episodes, and novelizations. All of this meant that Lucasfilm was trying to give fans closure for what could have been. However, in 2018, something major occurred, because in summer of that year, it was announced that the Clone Wars was officially saved, and that it was going to be returning once and for all. The show we all loved and cherished was finally going to be getting its long-awaited conclusion. Unsurprisingly, this event blew the minds of plenty of fans around the globe, including myself, and although it was revealed we would only be getting 12 episodes for the final season, the fact that we were getting a final season in the first place goes to show that Lucasfilm, or more specifically, Dave Filoni, really wanted to give us the proper ending that the Clone Wars deserved. By February 2020, the final season would officially air. However, now is the time where I really begin to explain how the Bad Batch came to be. The Bad Batch were introduced in the very first arc of the Clone Wars' final season. At the time, its members consisted of just 4 clones, each with their own unique skill sets: Hunter, Tech, Wrecker, and Crosshair. Surprisingly enough, they were originally planned to make their debuts several years ago, but as you all know by now, the cancellation of the show was what made this arc essentially trapped in limbo for several years. During this arc, the Bad Batch would help Rex and Anakin save Echo, who is long presumed to be dead, and after doing so, they would ultimately kill Trench and win happily ever after. After their hard-fought victory, Echo and Rex would part ways, and the former would end up joining the Bad Batch. However, outside of this arc, not much was known at the time about what would have happened to the Bad Batch. This meant that the Bad Batch had an incredibly obscure story that needed more development. After all, why would anybody care about a group of rogue clones that showed up mere weeks prior to the execution of Order 66 when they hadn't even been seen prior? They were going to appear for one story and then disappear without any additional characterization. Fortunately for them, however, 2 months after the final episode of The Clone Wars came out, it was announced that the Bad Batch would finally be getting a show of their own. At last, we would be getting more development for the Batch's obscure story and what occurred during the early days of the Empire. Thus, this was how the Bad Batch came to be. Ever since the cancellation of the Clone Wars occurred all the way back in 2012, it kept on having sporadic resurgences. And even after the show concluded, the popularity of the Clone Wars had grown to such an extent that everyone clamored for its continuation, with the Bad Batch having an incredibly obscure story, as well as more gaps between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope that needed to be filled in. Filoni perhaps saw the potential to continue on the legacy of the Clone Wars by making use of these loose ends. As a result, the Bad Batch would finally air in May 2021, exactly 1 year after the ending to the Clone Wars. after the Bad Batch's release, many were happy that it was carrying on the legacy of the Clone Wars, especially given the fact that it retained the same animation style as the latter and heavily explored what happened after the war's end. This is why the Bad Batch definitely had a lot of good things to offer us throughout the first season. The main thing I clearly loved about the first season were the major cameos we got for plenty of the episodes. Each of these cameos came as a big surprise to me, and it always got me looking forward and hyped for what was going to happen in the next episode. Some cameos were known about from the trailers, but there were others out there that weren't in the trailers and came as more of a surprise. An example of a cameo from the show that I liked was when Captain Rex came back and helped the Bad Batch remove their chips. I was literally shouting at 3 AM in the morning the moment I saw him appear on screen. But perhaps the main cameo that stood out to me was when Cad Bane, our beloved cowboy bounty hunter, made his unexpected return in the episode titled Reunion. Needless to say, I was super shocked to see him come back, especially considering the fact that he died in one of the unfinished story arcs. It had been such a long time since we last saw him, and I once again was feeling the hype, even more so than before. In short, these cameos definitely contributed to how good some of the episodes were, and seeing characters like Rex, Cad Bane, Gregor, and Kanan gave off nostalgic vibes. Another thing I liked about the first season was that it kept the Clone Wars alive. I was feeling a lot of Clone Wars vibes in watching the first episode. They nailed the opening with Order 66 and Palpatine's proclamation of the Galactic Empire, and it ties in perfectly with Revenge of the Sith, just like the final arc of Clone Wars did. And we also got to see the actions the Empire did immediately after being formed, occupying planets, phasing out the battle droids, attempting to replace the clones, and most significantly, burning Kamino to the ground. It picked up right where the Clone Wars left off, and the fact that it retained the same animation style as the latter was just amazing. It really did feel like a Season 8 in a way. To put it simply, the show did a good job by continuing on the story of the Clone Wars and showing the transition from Republic to Empire. The show also helped develop obscure characters and turn them into something better. Like I mentioned in the history part of the video, the Bad Batch were largely forgotten characters outside of the one arc they debuted in during the Clone Wars. They had the potential to be amazing, yes, given that a group of defective clones with special enhancements isn't a great concept, but at the same time, one arc simply wouldn't cut it. It simply wasn't enough time for them to get the development they deserved to have. However, now that the show is out, we can look forward to seeing more and more stories revolving around the Bad Batch. Finally, one other thing I really liked about the show was Crosshair, or more specifically, the massive amount of character development that Crosshair received. During the premiere, he's the only one of the Bad Batch to execute Order 66, and he further distances himself from his brothers. He's always been the most cynical member of the Batch, and seeing Crosshair turning on his brothers and joining the Empire made him a pretty awesome villain. Most of the best episodes in the season are the ones where Crosshair makes an appearance, and as a villain, he had loads of badass moments, like when he killed his own men for disobeying orders, hitting extremely precise targets, and just being so committed towards serving the Empire. Seeing this dynamic of a clone like Crosshair being so committed towards doing what needs to be done is a very chilling thing to watch. And actually, before I move on, I need to address something. When editing this video, I realized that I completely forgot to make a paragraph dedicated to me talking about our boy Captain Hauser. I feel ashamed of myself for forgetting, given the fact that he is a great character and knows what's right. But thankfully, I've already made a video dedicated to him. So, if you want to hear more about Captain Hauser, go check out my other video. Anyways, it's time to move on. However, in spite of all the show's positives, there were a ton of negatives and downsides with the Bad Batch. One particular problem with the show is the immense polarity between the compelling and filler episodes of the season. Some episodes were outstanding, whilst others sucked massively. I'll admit that not all episodes in the first season were bad. However, the main filler episode I'd like to highlight as a bad example is the 13th episode of the season, titled Infested. It was the first and only episode of the series that I truly disliked, and for good reason. I can literally summarize the plot of this entire episode in just a single sentence.
Poor Lizard gets her shop taken over by a horned alien, and her BFFs must come in to save the day, which they do. Now everything is back to normal. Hooray!
Filler episodes like these could easily be removed from the story with absolutely zero ramifications. Granted, while each and every TV show does have its fair share of bad and good episodes, a big reason why I disliked this one in particular was because it came late in the first season, and it also came immediately after a very good episode. We went from witnessing Hauser's epic speech on Ryloth in the previous episode to what? A bland, boring mission that involves transporting spice? It clearly proves how divided the season feels at times, and the huge downgrades it often takes when going from an extremely good episode to a really bad one. Another thing I didn't like about the first season was Omega.
What? You hate Omega as a character? Boo!
Oh, please calm down, dude. You're embarrassing me in front of the wizards. And actually, it's not Omega herself that I dislike. She's a pretty decent character, and had an okay start when we were introduced to her, and neither is she a Mary Sue, as she has had difficulties, like the time when she struggled shooting her bow. However, one thing I do dislike about Omega is the amount of idiotic decisions she tends to make. I know she's just a kid, well technically she's not, given that she's now revealed to be older than the Bad Batch, but regardless of that, some of the decisions she has made outright put the Bad Batch and herself in danger. For example, she made the dumb decision to save AZ, even though he didn't have a problem with sacrificing himself to ensure her safety. At that moment, Hunter clearly told her not to do so, and she would have likely drowned if not for Crosshair. She even activated the Dark Troopers to save her brothers from Crosshair, despite the fact that they explicitly told her not to interfere beforehand. Ironically, instead of improving the situation, she ended up worsening it, as the Bad Batch and Crosshair were all forced to fight the Dark Troopers the moment they got activated. Although you could name other instances of Omega being annoying, those two moments in particular are the ones when I felt annoyed by her the most. She just acts incredibly stubborn, especially during the later half of the series. But considering the fact that Ahsoka, and to a much lesser extent Luke, started off like this, it's to be expected from a young one. A third flaw with this season is that both Echo and Tech got considerably less spotlight. For all the members of the Bad Batch, the ones who got the most spotlight happened to be Hunter, Omega, Wrecker, and Crosshair. But for Echo, his only role throughout the entire season is merely to open doors or infiltrate databases. And similarly, the only role Tech plays is flying, repairing stuff, and being all nerdy. One example of Echo and Tech being underused is in episode 10. During the big fight scene with all the ATT walkers and clones, Hunter and Wrecker are clearly getting all the spotlight, as they are the ones constantly blowing stuff up and shooting the other clones. However, Echo and Tech just stand around doing close to nothing. Tech's attempts to repair the ATT they hijack are off screen, whereas Echo literally doesn't do anything. Not to mention the fact that when they get ambushed by clones, they initially put their hands up as opposed to fighting back. Even when it comes to interacting with Omega, Echo and Tech still get shafted. The ones who have had the most meaningful interactions with her are Hunter and Wrecker, and this comes as no surprise, given that they are like her father and big brother respectively. And Crosshair still got to have some meaningful interactions with Omega, especially during the season finale when they both saved each other. The characters who have interacted with Omega the most just so happen to correlate with the ones who got the most amount of development. This dynamic of them both getting less and less priority continues over and over again as the season drags on. And adding insult to injury, There are some episodes where they barely have any lines whatsoever. But how did they get less priority than Crosshair? After all, Crosshair was absent from a good chunk of the episodes, and Echo and Tech clearly had more appearances. Well, the truth is that for each instance that Crosshair appeared, his screen time was still meaningful, whereas Echo and Tech were kind of just there, and were treated like the fourth wheel. In other words, Crosshair appeared less but was utilized more, and Echo and Tech suffered from the opposite. Echo went from being a cadet to ARC, but after joining the Bad Batch, he's definitely an echo of what he once was. And just like Echo, Tech got a lot of spotlight in the arc he was introduced in, but is now suffering from technical difficulties. Finally, another problem with the first season is Sid. As much as I hate to admit it, I'm not a big fan of Sid. Her only role in the series is to give the Bad Batch mediocre and boring jobs. Granted, while the Batch does need to take on jobs as a way of getting paid and staying alive, it's still such a boring concept that serves as the main catalyst behind all of the filler episodes. Most of the best episodes in the season are typically the ones that do not revolve around Sid. And what's also baffling is that Sid arguably got more attention than either Echo or Tech did. She was a driving force for a good chunk of the episodes, owing to the fact that they were boring jobs for the Bad Batch to undertake. The fact that Sid got more attention than two members of the Batch goes to show how she outright stole the spotlight from the other characters, all for the sole purpose of frivolous adventures. Phew, glad that's off of my stomach. Considering all of the positives and negatives of the Bad Batch, it presents us a lot of intriguing questions. Is the Bad Batch really a bad show? Do the show's flaws outweigh all the good it did? Will the second season not disappoint us? Will Filoni not let us down? Well, here's the truth about the Bad Batch. No matter what anyone thinks of the Bad Batch, it is not a perfect show. It definitely does have its fair share of strengths and weaknesses. However, the word perfect is almost mythical in a way. You could apply it to anything really. A game, a book, a house, a car, and it wouldn't really fit in with any of those things well. Nothing is ever perfect no matter how hard you look at it. And despite all of its flaws, I very much have faith that Filoni will impress us with an even better second season. After all, this was his response for a continuation of the Clone Wars. He knows that such a successor needs to live up to the expectations of its predecessor, especially given the unpopularity of Rebels. As a result, this is how it can be improved. Echo and Tech clearly need the character development they can get. As I mentioned earlier, they are the two most underused members of the Bad Batch. They're both there, but that's about it. They don't do much other than spitting out random lines of dialogue and carrying out simple chores. However, despite how underused they are in the first season, there has been some progress with improving both characters. Firstly, we got to see at least one meaningful interaction they both had with Omega. In Echo's case, it was when he was helping her practice with her bow, and I believe we saw this in episode 6. While for Tech, we saw a scene of him on the bridge with Omega during the 8th episode, talking to her about what the war was like. The second season definitely leaves more room for family-like interactions, which is something that both characters need. Another thing that gives both Echo and Tech a chance at getting the attention they deserve is the fact that Filoni himself has brought attention towards obscure characters. Take Ventress, for example. She started out as a somewhat generic Sith assassin, but she then received valuable character development in the later seasons of Clone Wars. I mean, who could have anticipated she would become a bounty hunter of all things? And there's multiple other examples of obscure names who got their time to shine during the Clone Wars. If Filoni could bring said characters into the spotlight, then he can definitely do the same for Echo and Tech. And with the show getting season 2, I'm positive they'll eventually get the attention they rightfully deserve. Besides Echo and Tech, another reason why the Bad Batch will get better with the second season is because we have so many interesting surprises to look forward to. Keep in mind, the best thing the first season did was surprising us with multiple cameos from fan-favorite characters. If the first season could surprise us this much, there's no doubt that the second season can and will do the same. After all, Camino being destroyed and now let's say working for the Empire will mean a lot for the clones going forward, and we're already beginning to see the shift from clones to stormtroopers. It's inevitable that something major is in store for the clones in the near future, not to mention the fact that there are still a lot of loose threads that need to be answered. What's going on with Rex and Ahsoka post Order 66? What happened to Hauser? Etc, etc. And on top of all that, there's also the chance for even more cameos. Seeing fan favorites appear on screen once more will be a huge thing the show has in its favor to improve. As long as they don't do the returning characters dirty, seeing more and more cameos in the show will definitely be worth it. Outside of those things, there are a few things here and there that could make the show better, such as having the show be just as compelling as Clone Wars was, and dedicating less time towards Sid. However, there's no doubt given that enough time and effort, the Bad Batch will go above and beyond. The point I'm trying to convey here is that we still have a lot to be excited for, and the longer the Bad Batch continues, the more chances it has to rectify its own flaws. However, although the show can and will improve with Season 2, one major thing still needs to be answered. Is the Bad Batch a worthy successor? We've already talked about how the show came to be in the first place, what it did well, what it sucked at, and how there's room for improvement going forward, but can the show truly live up to the expectations of its predecessor? To answer that question, we need to take a look at what made Clone Wars the best of them all. Clone Wars stood out to fans because it had a legendary animation style, introduced fan-favorite characters, made use of very obscure characters, had a tragic story, and gave more personality to the clones. And these are just a couple of the many things it did well. Even the first 2 seasons, which are widely considered to not be very good, were still pretty impressive to me. It truly made the most out of the 3-year gap between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, showing just how the war was far greater than most of us realized. Has the Bad Batch lived up to what we got out of the Clone Wars? Well, no, at least not yet. Don't get me wrong, the first season of the Bad Batch definitely had a lot of good moments that brought back Clone Wars nostalgia. The series premiere, for instance, was a great start to the series, and the action it had to offer fit in well with Clone Wars. Other moments, such as the decommissioned battle droids and Venators, were also huge throwbacks to the Clone Wars. However, the series isn't as compelling as Clone Wars was, and still needs more room to grow. But as it turns out, the Bad Batch has multiple things in its favor. For one, the next season will allow more time and effort to be dedicated towards making the series more compelling. And second, although the primary focus is mainly on the Bad Batch, they have the potential to get even more development, just like the development the main trio of the Clone Wars received. And finally, the show does a great job at conveying the aftermath of the war and the initial rise of the Empire, something that isn't really explained in the movies. We saw the Empire's formation, the Imperial occupations of several planets, the introduction of clone replacements, and most importantly, the destruction of Camino. In a way, it keeps the Clone Wars alive, picking up the story right from where it previously ended. To put it bluntly, The Bad Batch was a show built upon obscure characters and the war left unfinished. The Clone Wars was, and still very much is, a popular cartoon, and the only way the creators saw fit to keep it alive in some form was by making this show. Think about it. We all loved Clone Wars, and Filoni clearly knew, so his response to us was by making this show solely for more Clone Wars content. And with all things considered, can the Bad Batch really become the worthy successor to the show we all loved? Well, the short answer is yes. It can absolutely be just as great as the Clone Wars was, as long as it gets the time and effort needed to make the story more compelling. After all, the Clone Wars didn't become a brilliant story overnight. It needed multiple seasons worth of development. It even had crappy animation at times during its early stages, but again, things need time to get better and better, and not everything is going to be perfect on the first attempt. Even when we look at Star Wars as a whole, the franchise needed decades of new stories and development to get to where it is now. The Bad Batch has already accomplished a lot of good, and I am confident that the show will accomplish even more good in the upcoming season. We have a lot to look forward to, and I'm excited for it all. Thanks for watching, everyone.